So another topic is, this week we were talking about problems with batch imports or with bulk imports. And I was saying this a lot, that it's with, sometimes you can't use these cloud functions because they don't have enough memory and so on. This was the prime example how this happens, or in which problems you actually get if you do something like that. And what we've did was basically and I showed this before, the goal was we had some CSV file and we were putting this into a relational database here. And we had in an IDE, and the cool thing is with AWS, they have their own IDE, Cloud9. And that Cloud9, actually, the goal with that was read the CSV file and put the data into your database here in a batch way. I also showed this, I think, last time. So the problem was in this, the Cloud9 instance, this is running on EC2, like on a virtual instance. And your relational database, the RDS, also has an instance. And this was the prime example for the scaling problem that you have if you do this traditionally, where you get yourself a virtual machine and you do, or a virtual server, and you do that. Because the CSV file actually was that big that the Cloud9 could never read it into memory. And basically the IDE always crashed because the server ran out of memory and nothing was happening anymore. And then he had to restart the server, and it's super annoying. So that was, of course, because we were using a too small instance here. The file was large. It was just a few hundred megabytes, but nevertheless, it was too much for having everything in memory of the virtual instance here, of the EC2 instance. So what we had to do was actually go in and say, okay, let's shut this instance down. Let's get a bigger one, and let's start this bigger one with Cloud9. And then it was no problem reading this in and writing it out to the relational database. The funny thing was happening then, the RDS database also had a bit of a small instance. And so this thing could actually read the data from here and was trying to dump it into the database, but the database was like, tilt. And so we had to wait for a long time to actually do this, because we didn't just want to change the database type as well. So that's something that is always a bit tricky when you work with instances, when you work with resources that you reserve for these kind of tools, that you run into these kind of problems. That's why I also very often say for the beginning, use small data sets. That's nothing. That's not what you should do, that you start here with big data sets and realize everything. Because these big data sets, then you get into this trouble very, very quickly. You want to set here first small instances. And in the beginning, it was no problem for him, because he was just reading like 11 rows from here and writing the 11 rows here into the table, which was absolutely no problem. And from a testing perspective, but when you want to do a bulk import, problematic.
How do you plan for this, or is this more like a trial and error type of thing?
Well, the planning is always a bit difficult, because it's usually a bit hard to foresee or to plan how big will your file be in memory in here. So you most likely you're going to go with a larger instance here just to be safe. But this has its limits. Like whenever this file gets too big, then this is at the end. This is just a single. This is vertical scaling, right? We're just making the instance bigger. We're not trying to distribute the workload. We're just pumping this up.
Yeah.
So it's good if like you don't always need to use distributed systems here. If this is enough, then it's enough. If the files are not that big, but yeah. So what would be a solution for this to actually change out the way how you process the data here, so that you, for instance, go into a tool, something like a Spark. Let's call it derivative, something like a Glue on AWS or Databricks on Azure. Then it's easier to actually use these bigger files because you're distributing the workload through many of the systems. So you read it in from the CSV file. Then within Spark, it generates the data frames, and these data frames, then the data gets distributed to each an individual machine, and these machines then write to the table. The problem remains that your relational database needs to actually be able to cope with all the data that is coming in. But from a processing perspective, this is how you can resolve this monolithic thing here, or ETL tool. So vertical scaling, always finite. At some point the instances will be too big to actually, or will not be big enough to actually process your large files, or will be super expensive, so you need something else.